The day Marcus Holt lost everything, it wasn't the divorce papers that broke him. It was watching his 10-year-old son, Jake, climb into the back of a stranger's truck with a duffel bag that used to sit in their garage. The bag held Jake's riding gloves, the ones Marcus had bought him for his 8th birthday. The ones they'd used when they practiced slow circles in the empty parking lot behind the old high school. The Harley was gone, sold out from under him while he was at work, the title forged, the money pocketed by a woman who'd stopped seeing him years before she left. The house wasn't his anymore. The judge had seen a mechanic with grease under his nails and a motorcycle club patch in his closet, and he'd seen a deadbeat biker. The words were spoken in court, entered into record, repeated in the hallway by reporters who didn't know that Marcus had never missed a child support payment, never raised a hand, never failed to show up for Jake's little league games even when the other parents whispered and moved their children away. But the court saw a man with long hair, leather vests, and a garage full of motorcycle parts. The court saw a stereotype, and stereotypes don't get custody, they get called deadbeats. Marcus stood in the driveway of a house that no longer belonged to him, holding a cardboard box with 3 t-shirts, a photograph of Jake on his first bike, a tiny Honda 50cc they'd rebuilt together, and a single Craftsman wrench. The wrench had been his father's. Before that, his grandfather's. It was the only thing the court couldn't take, because it was the only thing nobody thought worth taking. In his wallet, $300, that was it. That was the empire. Before we continue, if you believe that a father's love matters more than a judge's gavel, if you believe that the men's society labels are often the ones holding everything together when nobody's watching, if you believe in justice delayed but never denied, then I want to ask you something. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment with your city, your state, your country. Let us know where you're watching from. This channel is built on stories like Marcus's, stories that don't make the evening news because they don't fit the narrative. Your subscription tells us to keep finding them. Your comment reminds the next person watching that they're not alone in whatever fight they're facing. So subscribe now and tell us where you stand. The wind cut sharper than usual that November evening. Marcus spent the first 3 nights sleeping in the back of his friend's pickup truck, parked behind a closed-down laundromat. The friend had a family, a mortgage, couldn't risk harboring a deadbeat for long. Marcus understood. He didn't blame him. He blamed himself for not seeing it coming, for trusting a woman who'd already proven what she was capable of, for thinking that showing up every day, working every hour, loving his son without condition would be enough in a system that weighed appearances over substance. On the 4th night, the temperature dropped below freezing. Marcus walked the industrial side of town, looking for anywhere warm, anywhere he could close his eyes without being moved along by police or security guards. He passed an old brick building with a faded sign, hardware, closing soon. The windows were boarded. The roof sagged. The parking lot was cracked concrete sprouting weeds through every fissure. Most people saw a teardown. Marcus saw 4 walls and a door that locked. He found the owner the next morning, a retired man named Gil who was waiting for demolition permits. Gil looked at Marcus, looked at the grease still ground into his knuckles, the wrench in his back pocket, the hollow eyes of a man who hadn't slept in days, and didn't ask questions. He asked for $100 a month, first and last up front. Marcus handed over $200 of his $300 and kept the last $100 in his pocket like a bullet he might need later. The building had no electricity, no running water. The toilet was a bucket behind a curtain. The floor was concrete covered in decades of oil stains, paint splatter, and the ghost footprints of workers long dead. Marcus swept it anyway. He swept it for 3 hours, until the concrete was as clean as concrete gets, until he could see the patches where someone had once painted yellow safety lines. Then he sat in the center of that empty floor, holding his grandfather's wrench, and he cried. Not for the Harley, not for the house, for Jake, for the Saturdays that were gone, for the writing lessons he wouldn't give, for the voice that would stop calling him dad and start calling him something else, something smaller, something the boy's mother would teach him to say. But even in that empty building, in that frozen hour, Marcus possessed something nobody could take. He knew motorcycles the way sailors know the sea. He could listen to an engine and tell you which cylinder was misfiring, which bearing was worn, which carburetor jet was clogged. He could feel vibration through a frame and know if the swing arm was twisted. He could look at a basket case, a bike in pieces, rusted, forgotten, declared dead, and see the machine it wanted to become. For 15 years, he'd worked in other people's shops. He'd built choppers that won trophies, restored classics that collectors paid fortunes for, customized baggers that crossed the country and back without a hiccup. He'd done it all for hourly wages while the shop owners took the credit and the profit. He'd never complained. He'd shown up early, stayed late, eaten lunch with his hands still black from the morning's work. Now he had a building nobody wanted, $100, and a wrench. He spent $50 on a used generator from a pawn shop. The man behind the counter looked at him like he was buying a casket. Marcus didn't care. The generator coughed to life on the third pull, and suddenly he had light. He spent $20 on flyers printed at a copy shop, simple black and white sheets that said, Holt Cycle WORKS, honest builds, fair prices, no job too small. He spent the last $30 on a case of oil, 2 spark plugs, and a used tire iron from a garage sale. The first week brought no customers. The second week brought a teenager with a seized Honda Rebel, a bike his father had given up on. Marcus worked on it for 14 hours, charged the kid $40, and threw in a new air filter he'd found in a junk pile. The kid rode away grinning. The kid came back with his father. The father came back with his riding club. Word spread the way it always spreads among people who have been burned. Marcus didn't invent problems. He didn't replace parts that didn't need replacing. When a single mother brought him a Suzuki with a slipping clutch, he showed her the worn plates, explained exactly what was wrong, and charged her half what the dealership quoted. When a veteran on disability brought him a Harley with electrical gremlins, Marcus traced every wire himself rather than replacing the entire harness, saving the man $800 he didn't have. The veterans started coming first, then the single parents, then the kids working minimum wage who'd saved for a year to buy a running bike and needed someone to keep it that way. Then the old-timers, the guys who remembered when motorcycles were built by hand and respected a man who still worked that way. By spring, Marcus was sleeping 4 hours a night, working the other 20. He installed a used sink, ran a hose from the neighboring building's spigot, paid the neighbor $20 a month in cash. He built a workbench from salvaged lumber and a discarded door. He hung a single fluorescent light above the bench, and in that cone of yellow light, he rebuilt engines that purred like they were new. The building never stopped looking like a ruin from the outside, but inside it became something else. It became honest. It became safe. It became the place where people brought machines that mattered to them and left with machines that ran. And every Saturday morning, Marcus drove 2 hours to the supervised visitation center. He sat in a room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs, waiting for Jake to arrive. Sometimes Jake came. Sometimes he didn't. Soccer practice, a friend's birthday, a cold his mother said he had. When Jake did come, they didn't talk about the shop. They talked about school. About the Honda 50cc, which Jake's mother had sold too. About the rides they would take someday, the roads they would travel, the bikes they would build together. Marcus never missed a Saturday. Not when the shop was empty and he couldn't afford gas. Not when business exploded and he had customers waiting. Not when he was sick. Not when he was exhausted. Not when the drive felt like driving through his own heartbreak. He showed up because Jake was the reason the wrench moved. Jake was the reason the generator started. Jake was the reason Marcus Holt didn't become the deadbeat the court named him. By the second year, Holt Cycle Works had expanded into the building next door, another abandoned property Marcus bought with savings he shouldn't have had. He hired his first employee, a discharged Marine with a prosthetic leg and a gift for wiring that made Marcus's own work look clumsy. The Marine had been turned down by 6 shops before Marcus. He cried when Marcus handed him the keys to the parts room. By the 3rd year, there were 6 employees. By the 5th, 12. Marcus didn't hire resumes. He hired stories. A woman escaping domestic violence who'd learned to weld in a community college program. A former convict who'd learned engine building in prison and couldn't get an interview anywhere else. A kid with autism who could memorize torque specifications after seeing them once and never forgot a part number. Marcus built his team the way he built bikes, from overlooked pieces with patience until the whole thing ran. The shop's reputation grew beyond the local writers. Custom builders from 3 states away started bringing their most difficult projects, the vintage restorations, the one-off fabrications, the bikes that had stumped everyone else. Marcus never advertised. He never had to. The work spoke, and the word traveled. But the work wasn't the point. The museum wasn't the plan. The plan was Jake. Every birthday, Marcus sent a card with a photograph of a bike they'd built together in the old days, or a bike he was working on now with a note. This one has your name on it if you ever want to learn the clutch. Every Christmas, a small gift, a model motorcycle, a book on engine theory, a leather tool roll with his initials. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would trigger the court's scrutiny. Just presence, just proof that he was still there, still building, still waiting. Jake was 14 when he first walked into the shop unannounced. Marcus was under a 1974 Triumph, adjusting the primary chain, when he saw a pair of sneakers he recognized. He slid out on his back, grease on his forehead, and looked up at his son. The boy was taller now. His voice was deeper. But his eyes were the same eyes that had watched Marcus teach him to feather a clutch in that empty parking lot. "I want to learn," Jake said. "The real stuff, not just writing, building." Marcus didn't cry. He handed Jake the wrench. His grandfather's wrench, the one that had started everything. For 2 years, Jake came every weekend he could. He learned to gap spark plugs, to true wheels, to read the color of exhaust smoke like a language. He learned that a motorcycle isn't a machine. It's a conversation between human and metal, between intention and physics, between the builder's patience and the rider's trust. He learned that his father wasn't a deadbeat. He learned that his father was a man who'd been called something he wasn't, and had spent every day since proving the name wrong. By the time Jake turned 16, Holt Cycle Works had outgrown the original building and the one next door. Marcus bought the entire block, 6 buildings, most still abandoned, all destined for demolition until he saw what they could become. He didn't build a bigger shop. He built something else. He built a museum. Not a museum of motorcycles, though there were motorcycles. Over 200 of them, everyone restored or built in his shop, everyone with a story. It was a museum of second chances. Of the Marine with the prosthetic leg who now ran the electrical department. Of the woman who'd welded her way from a shelter to a senior fabricator position. Of the kid with autism who could disassemble and reassemble a Vitwin in under 4 hours, and who now trained new hires. The walls held photographs of every employee on their first day and their 5-year anniversary. The floor was the same concrete Marcus had swept that first night, preserved under glass in the center of the main hall. The workbench with the salvaged door was there, the single fluorescent light still hanging above it, still working, and on a pedestal under its own glass case sat the wrench, his grandfather's wrench. The only thing the court hadn't taken, because it was the only thing nobody thought worth taking. Jake gave the first tour. He was 17, standing in front of a group of at-risk youth brought in by a community program, and he told them the story of the empty building and the frozen night and the man who'd swept concrete for 3 hours because it was the only thing he could control. He told them about the single mother with the Suzuki, the veteran with the electrical gremlins, the employees who'd been told they were unemployable. He told them that his father had been called a deadbeat biker by a judge who never saw him work until 3 a.m. to finish a bike for a kid who needed it for a job interview. He told them that labels are given by people who don't stay long enough to learn the truth. And then he walked them to the center of the museum, to the glass case with the wrench, and he said, "This is where it started. $300, 1 wrench, 1 son who almost forgot who his father was, and 1 man who wouldn't let him." The museum opened to the public on a Saturday in October, 5 years after Jake's first unannounced visit. By then, Holt Cycle Works employed 47 people. The custom builds were featured in international magazines. The restoration work was sought by collectors who flew in from Europe and Japan. The training program for at-risk youth had placed over 100 graduates into paid apprenticeships across the country. Marcus still arrived at 5 a.m. He still swept the floors himself, though he now had a staff for that. He still worked on the bikes that mattered most, the ones for veterans, for single parents, for kids who reminded him of Jake. He still kept the photograph of Jake on the first bike in his office, next to a newer photograph of Jake in his own Holt Cycle Works jacket, giving a tour to a group of teenagers who hung on every word. The ex-wife came once. She stood in the back of a tour group, unrecognized by Jake, who was explaining the primary chain adjustment on a 1974 Triumph. She watched her son speak with authority and passion about a world she'd tried to keep him from. She watched him gesture to the glass case with the wrench, to the photograph of the man she'd called a deadbeat, to the concrete floor preserved under glass that had once been covered in oil and hope. She left before the tour ended. She didn't leave a message. She didn't need to. The museum was the message. Marcus saw her go. He was watching from an upper balcony, the same way he used to watch Jake practice slow circles in the empty parking lot. He didn't follow her. He didn't need to. He had what he'd been fighting for. He had his son. He had his name. He had a building full of proof that the system gets it wrong sometimes, that the labels stick until someone peels them off, that a man with $300 and a wrench can build something that outlasts the judgment. The museum now draws visitors from every state and dozens of countries. School groups come to learn about mechanical history. Veterans organizations come to see what's possible after service. Motorcycle clubs come to pay respect to a builder who never turned away a patch, never judged a cut, never forgot that the machine matters more than the rider's reputation. And every Saturday, Jake gives the tour. He starts at the entrance where a plaque reads, "This museum was built by a deadbeat biker. If you're wearing a label that doesn't fit, keep building. The label will fall off eventually." He ends at the glass case with the wrench. He tells the story of the $300. He tells the story of the frozen nights. He tells the story of the Saturdays at the visitation center, the cards with photographs, the years of showing up when no one would have blamed him for giving up. And then he opens the case. He picks up the wrench. He holds it in his hand, the same hand that once held his father's finger while learning to walk, the same hand that once gripped handlebars while learning to ride, the same hand that now signs paychecks and shakes hands with visitors who have traveled thousands of miles to see where it started. "This is my father's wrench," Jake says, "and this is my father's story, but it's also yours if you need it, because sometimes all a person needs is $300, one wrench, and a reason not to quit." The visitors applaud. Jake doesn't look at them. He looks at the photograph on the wall, the one of Marcus under the 1974 Triumph, grease on his forehead, looking up at his son with the same expression he'd worn since the day Jake was born. The expression that says, "I'm here, I'm building, I'm waiting, and I will never stop." If you're still with us, if this story moved something in you, if you know someone who's wearing a label that doesn't fit, who's been called something they're not, who's building in the dark while the world sleeps, then do this. Leave a comment. Write "Never Quit." Tell us where you're watching from. What city, what state, what country. Let the next person who reads this know they're not alone in their fight. Let Marcus know his story traveled farther than he ever imagined. And if you want more stories like this, stories of fathers who wouldn't surrender, of names that were taken and earned back, of small beginnings that became monuments, hit that subscribe button. The algorithm doesn't favor stories like this. It favors noise. Your subscription is a vote for substance. Your subscription tells us to find the next Marcus, the next Jake, the next wrench in a glass case that started a revolution. Life doesn't always reward the good guys on schedule. Sometimes the label sticks for years. Sometimes the court gets it wrong. Sometimes the person who sold your Harley, took your son, called you a deadbeat. Sometimes they never say they're sorry. But Marcus Holt's story reminds us that apologies aren't the point. The point is what you build while you're waiting for the apology. The point is the museum that rises from the ruin. The point is the son who learns the truth and chooses to stay. A Harley can be sold. A house can be taken. A name can be dragged through courtrooms and newspapers and whispered conversations in parking lots. But skill cannot be repossessed. Integrity cannot be foreclosed. And a father's love cannot be sold at auction, cannot be divided in a settlement, cannot be erased by a judge's gavel or a mother's lie. Sometimes the man they call a deadbeat is the only one who never stopped showing up. If this story reached you, if it reminded you of your own fight, your own label, your own $300 and single wrench, then share it. Send it to someone who needs to remember why they started. Send it to someone who's sweeping concrete at 3 in the morning, wondering if it matters. It matters. It all matters. Every sweep of the broom, every turn of the wrench, every Saturday drive to a visitation center that breaks your heart and rebuilds it anyway. Subscribe to Biker's Kingdom, not for the algorithm, for the next Marcus, for the next Jake, for the next person who needs to know that deadbeat is just a word until you prove it wrong. Because sometimes all a person needs is $300, one wrench, and a son who remembers.